first snap of the game, essentially shared almost equal carries in tandem between DeAndre Swift and Elijah Holyfield. If anything, Swift may have been, he actually was the leading rusher for Georgia that season, even though technically in most games he wasn't the player on the field for the very first snap. So starter is a little bit of a loaded phrase there, but who do I think Georgia's leading rusher is going to be? I guess there's a part of me that does kind of gravitate in the direction of Kendall Milton on this. I know Milton really wants to stay healthy and make it a full 15 games for the Dogs here this season. It's hard not to notice the degree to which a lot of Georgia fans are talking about Kenny McIntosh right now, and I do get that. There's a lot of energy around McIntosh. In fact, our DawgNation Atlanta Braves fan poll the other day, I believe McIntosh won that. I believe. I'm trying to remember, but I believe he won that. And of course, don't forget, when you vote in the DawgNation fan poll, you have a chance to win a family 4-pack of Braves tickets here this summer, which is really, really fun. But I believe McIntosh may have won that. So it seems like the gravitational pull, if you will, right now is in the direction of McIntosh, but I'm still kind of thinking about Milton on that. I think the other big question for me is this what we kind of think of as traditional Georgia with the tandem of backs, the way it was once Holyfield and Swift, and obviously Chubb and Michelle before that? Is that what McIntosh and Milton become, or is this still the kind of ensemble type deal where you hear a lot from Dajon Edwards, who I do think is really a potentially very interesting player on this Georgia team here this season. Obviously, some of Branson Robinson there as well. That would appear to be our cue that we're now on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, all of our video platforms. Good morning to all of you. And thanks for being here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp here today. I think we're heading for a really fun show, and we're glad to have you with us for it. We're going to take like 60 more seconds. We'll get the regular show started after that. Keith Venny says he believes that Kenny McIntosh is going to win the Heisman, which is a very interesting prediction. Here's like the one thing about McIntosh is, of all the players we kind of think about for Georgia this year, kind of doing more because of who's no longer here, McIntosh just sort of feels like the perfect player to fit into the template that James Cook has established for Georgia. That dynamic weapon in the pass game. If you'll remember, Kirby Smart talked about this in one of his summertime interviews about how Georgia wants to kind of build those NFL backs. That means throwing to them out of the backfield. So some of McIntosh is going to be through the air and not on the ground, which kind of goes back to something that Mike Leach said at Media Days the other day about his own running back production. This is relevant because Georgia plays Mississippi State, but it's also kind of relevant because of what we're talking about right here, that Leach said, hey, when it comes to yards for a running back, a receiving yard counts just as much as a rushing yard does. Philosophically, I don't know that I 100% agree with that because of what a rushing yard has a chance to do for you with a little bit less risk attached to it. But in general, it is an interesting idea for a guy like McIntosh too, who, if you're thinking about like, big time, and one of our commenters said, how about a Heisman Trophy push? Any kind of end of season award recognition or like a first team all SEC type deal or something along those lines. If he were to earn that over the course of the season, I do think for him it is that sort of total collection of yards, what he does on the ground and what he also provides through the air also. Randy Hall says your projected offensive line for the Oregon game. Here's my biggest question related to that. It is, how healthy is Tate Ratledge? We talked about this a little bit yesterday in our cool down, the R.S. Andrews cool down at the end of the show, that right now it seems like that Liz Frank situation that Ratledge has dealt with is just kind of lingering a little bit. If he's healthy, I believe he's one of Georgia's best 5. And if he's healthy, I think he gives Georgia a chance to have a truly great offensive line. It would be easy to kind of lean in the direction of the veterans here on this with Xavier Truss and Warren Erickson occupying those 2 of their guard spots. But Ratledge, if healthy, I think is clearly one of your best 5. I'd be very interested to see what happens with Lamarius Mims here. Is he like sort of that Swiss Army knife guy that kind of sits in that 6th man position? Obviously, Georgia did a good job of holding on to him over the course of the offseason. And then the other guy, an example of a less heralded recruit that seems to have earned a lot of praise while at Georgia's Devin Willock. That's a guy that I think is a part of all this too. But you asked for a prediction, so I'll give it to you, then we'll start the show after that. Give me Broderick and McClendon as your 2 tackles. Give me SVP, obviously, as the man in the middle. Bill Cartwright style, as Ray Clay would have said in the old days of the Chicago Bulls starting announcements. And then at the 2 guard spots, I'm going to be optimistic here and say that Ratledge is healthy and he starts maybe at the right guard spot. And I guess Xavier Truss is your left guard. Am I right about that? What do you think about that? Jones, Truss, SVP, Ratledge, McClendon. Where am I wrong? Y'all tell me. Maybe we'll talk about this after the show as a part of our R.S. Andrews cool down when we're all said and done. For now, though, Georgia got a commit yesterday. We'll talk about that. Georgia's got another big-time receiver set to visit here this weekend. We'll talk to Terrence Edwards about that. We're also going to have some fun with something from the past that I think a lot of you were maybe more aware of than I was, but it becomes actually a really good springboard for us to get into something here today, which is that as we get closer to the 2022 season, I think Georgia fans have justifiable reasons to be confident, and if anything, maybe they should raise their overall confidence level, expectation level for the season that's about to take place. I will tell you why right off the top as DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Merriweather and Tharp, begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Merriweather and Tharp, your source for Georgia divorce. Find them online at theatlantadivorceteam.com.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
I like old stuff. I like things that, historic thing, what things like that. I'm not smart enough to be a historian, but I do appreciate history. And there was this thing yesterday that kind of got some attention that I wasn't aware of. And I think a lot of you probably were aware of it, but it was kind of new to me. So I spent a good bit of time yesterday kind of reading up more about this, learning more about this, and I don't know, it's really cool. And I think it sets us up for kind of a fun conversation about Georgia football here today. So let me start with something that's from the distant past that maybe kind of doesn't quite matter all that much, but let me see if I can kind of make it into something that's worth our attention here today. So there was an online conversation taking place yesterday. Our buddy Wes Blankenship was a part of that. And Matt Stinchcomb, the brother of our John Stinchcomb, of course, John joins us each and every week here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp. Matt, his brother, also a media figure as well, SEC Network, great former Dog, of course, on his way into the High School Football Hall of Fame here in the state of Georgia, here coming up very soon there, too. But they're kind of talking about whatever, and I don't even really know what the genesis of the conversation was. But Matt Stinchcomb, in the midst of this Twitter conversation, shared a letter from the great former Georgia defensive coordinator, went on to be a successful head coach at Georgia Southern, but a lot of Georgia fans remember him as the defensive coordinator back in the Junkyard Dog era when Georgia won the national championship in 1980. That's Erk Russell. Now, I wasn't aware of this. A lot of you seem to be. But, man, I had a really good time reading this letter yesterday, and then I kind of went on to kind of read a lot more about this. Let me show this to you for a second from our buddy Matt on Twitter, and then we'll kind of get into the letter itself. So Matt kind of put this out there. It's a letter from Russell, and one of the great lines that the letter includes, Matt calls it the greatest opening and closing line to any letter, perhaps even in all of literatures, penned by the great Erk Russell. So that's kind of the setup for Matt Stinchcomb on this, our good friend who was kind of a part of a Twitter conversation about this yesterday. And I want to briefly kind of read this letter to you and sort of set up a Georgia football conversation around this letter here today. So I think we have the letter from Matt's tweet. I want to read this. Now, first of all, let me say this. How cool is it that Erk Russell, who if you know anything about Russell, you know this, the thing that he was famous for, bald head, he would, and this is obviously not really socially acceptable in 2022, but back then with his bald head, he would like ram his bald head against the players' helmets to the point that Russell was, as they say in pro wrestling, sort of juicing like right there. Like he had just had blood streaming down his face before the game. That was the way that he would get fired up for stuff back then. And obviously every Georgia fan kind of got fired up around that too. But the same guy that would slam his head against a player wearing a helmet to the point that Russell bled also sat down at a typewriter and typed out a letter. Like, I mean, don't you love the fact that that's the same guy that typing out a letter on a typewriter doing the ding, but also like bleeding from the forehead before a game? I mean, folks, we really used to have a culture. Like a guy like Russell to be that sort of multifaceted, faceted, I mean to say. I mean, we used to have a culture with guys like Russell being comfortable doing all of that. But let me just read the letter to you because this is great. So he is penning this letter to his players prior to the start of the 1980 season. Now, you know how that ends. So what Russell writes is, gentlemen, and lineman in parentheses, which is sort of a great start all the way around. Like this is, I mean, Matt Stinchcomb calls it literature. I think it probably was, and it was written July 7th, 1980. He says, the football season of 1980 will be my 17th as a Georgia Bulldog. This is Erk Russell writing here. During this time, there have been many thrilling Saturdays of competition, each with its individual memories because each game has its own personality. There are two Saturday traditions and experiences which have remained basically the same throughout the years for me, and I'd like to share them with you. The first one concerns the railroad track crowd. He puts this in all caps. He says, these are my people because they love the Dogs almost as much as I do. Oh, I know they do some crazy things like turning over our opponents' buses sometimes, and now and then they throw one another down the bank into the street below. But they stamp out kudzu, and they pull for us to win, and that ain't bad. Russell goes on to write, if you can get off the bus to the cheers the railroad, it says, if you can get off the bus to the cheers the railroad track crowd and walk down those steps to the dressing room and not be inspired to play football as best as you possibly can, something important is missing beneath the Georgia jersey you wear. Like this is one of the great letters of all time. He says, it is impossible not to be inspired. They choke me up. Now, this is what Russell writes, and this is really cool. He says, the season of 1980 will be the last for the railroad track crowd. A great Georgia tradition will have passed with a new addition to our stadium. The view from the tracks will be no more. Your team will be the last Georgia team to be greeted and cheered by the railroad track crowd. Wouldn't it be fitting if their last team was also the best Georgia team ever? Think about it. He goes on to write this. Another Saturday tradition which has meant so much to me over the years can be stated very simply. There ain't nothing like being a Bulldog on Saturday night after winning a football game. He goes on to say, I mean like whooping Tennessee to start the season and then 10 more and then another one. Now here's how he closes the letter, and this is great. He says, this is the game plan. We have no alternate plan. And he signs it, sincerely, Coach Russell, Erkskin Russell, the assistant head football coach of the Georgia Bulldogs. So a couple of things there really quickly. So I kind of went and looked at this because this is before my time. I really have no living memory of any of this. But the east end zone at Georgia now is completely filled in, and it kind of makes sort of a horseshoe look for the stadium. But prior to the 1980 season, or I should say, post 1980, or 1980 and before, was what I mean to say, that end zone section of bleachers was not there. And I went back and looked online, saw some pictures of this. You can actually see it's actually a really cool look, the way in which Sanford Stadium looked back then, where folks were sitting on the railroad tracks. And I read a lot of stories about this. There was a bunch of wild stuff that went on there. It's almost like what you sort of think of as like the bleachers or like the rooftop buildings in Wrigley Field, something like that. Like the photos that I saw kind of gave off that vibe. I don't want to share them with you live on video. They're not my photos. I don't own them, so I don't want to share that with you, but you can go find it online. It's not hard to find. And it's a really cool look. And Russell saying, we want to play for these people, the railroad track crowd, that's my people. Well, guess what? I think, in the spirit of this show that lives on far long after the railroad track crowd is done, hopefully the same thing is true for us there as well, that this show exists for the railroad track crowd. This show exists for the sort of the common man Georgia fan who, just likes the Dogs and wants to root on them and wants to inspire the team to play better the way the railroad track crowd may have in Erk Russell's day. Let it be so that we live on for the railroad track crowd here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Meriwether and Tharp. At least I hope that's the case. But it's also the end of the video, or I should say the letter there from Russell that I just love. This is our game plan. We have no alternate plan. And I think as we move ahead to 2022, I hope that Georgia fans adopt that same mindset. Because that's what seems to be the debate right now, right? Hey, Georgia got over the hump and they won the national championship of 2021. But should they accept an alternate plan for the upcoming season? Should they settle for less than that in the upcoming season? Should they be left to assume that the team they have this year is not up to the standard of what it was in the 2021 season? Well, my guess is if Georgia coaches who are, I think, just as spirited as Russell was back in his day, or at least they embodied some of that same spirit, I think if they were to communicate right now their feelings about the upcoming year, I think they would also say, hey, we have no alternate plans. What we did a year ago, pushing towards a national championship, that is also what we want to push forward in this upcoming year there as well. And settling for less than that is not the kind of thing that we're going to be okay with. And as you head towards the upcoming year, I think Georgia fans should, maybe raise their level of confidence. I think Georgia fans should be justified in raising their level of expectation. And I want to speak for a minute here about why and kind of shift gears to a slightly different topic here for a moment. I think when you look at who Georgia is most commonly compared to for the upcoming season, I think you see some interesting things to start to emerge. Now, some of this is like Georgia versus Alabama. We do a lot of, hey, how does Georgia compare against Alabama? Alabama has sort of stood as Georgia's longtime arch nemesis. The Dogs finally got over that hump last year. We have done no shortage of topics and conversations related to Georgia and its comparison with Alabama. Let's don't do that for a moment, though. Let's look at Ohio State. That's the other team that Georgia is often compared to, and in this year's preseason rankings, Ohio State's going to probably be ranked ahead of UGA. Let's compare Georgia and Ohio State for a moment, because I thought yesterday Ohio State head coach Ryan Day, speaking at Big Ten Media Days, I thought he said something that's pretty interesting. And even though what he said was not about Georgia, to me, it's a absolute signal. It's an absolute representation of why, to use Erk Russell's line here, Georgia fans should have no alternate plan for this upcoming season other than competing at the highest level for the national championship all over again. Let me show you this. So, the story for Ohio State a year ago. They were very good offensively, probably maybe the nation's best offense, at least alongside Alabama in that discussion, but they were not good defensively at all. And over the course of this offseason, they've hired a new defensive coordinator. His name's Jim Knowles. He comes from Oklahoma State. He did a good job there. And he is being tasked with a big transformation for the Buckeyes. Let me show you the quote here from Ryan Day on this about the expectations that Day has for Knowles as he steps into the defensive coordinator position there at Ohio State. Day says at Big Ten Media Days, in terms of expectations, we expect a top 10 defense. That's what we want. When we've played our best football, it's because we've played really good defense. We've been balanced, and we've played complementary football. That's Ryan Day at Ohio State speaking at Big Ten Media Days. So what Day says is, now this is a team that's going to be picked by many to win the national championship. They're going to be ranked ahead of Georgia in the preseason poll. And what Day is saying is, we expect to have a top 10 defense. Now, what I'd say in response to that is, well, it's great that's your expectation, but I would also say if you want to win the national championship this year, that's a requirement that you better be top 10 in defense and top 10 in offense. And for Ohio State, that's going to be a dramatic leap forward over where it was a year ago, which kind of brings us back to Georgia here for a moment. But if you've got a coach like Ohio State's Ryan Day having that kind of big talk at Big Ten Media Days, once again, I think it shines the light on kind of where a program like that is to start the upcoming season compared to, I think, the much more favorable position that Georgia finds itself in. I want to give you a couple of numbers here. That when it comes to Ohio State producing a top 10 defense, and my belief that you have to have a top 10 offense and defense in order to be able to win the national championship, something that Georgia did last year. Georgia's actually top 5 in both categories, really. Alabama, the only other team to be in the top 10. That's kind of stands the testament. If you're not very, very good, top 10 level on both sides of the ball, you're probably going to fall short of winning the national championship. That's why Ohio State didn't even make the playoff a year ago. The Buckeyes have a lot of ground to make up for if they want to make good on Day's prediction they'll be top 10 by the year's done. Let me give you a couple of numbers here. Think about a very simple stat, one we can all understand, like the number of points you give up. Obviously, offensively last year, Ohio State was great. They were number 1 in points scored per game for the entire country last year. Do you know that defensively they were just 38th? 38th. They were 38th in the country last year in the number of points they allowed on a per-game basis. If you care about fancy stats like ESPN's Football Power Index, no surprise here that Ohio State was the number 1 rated offense according to ESPN FPI last season. Their defense, though, just 43rd. Now think about this. There are a lot of people who think Ohio State is a more likely national championship team than Georgia here this year. And to become that, they have to be what Day says he believes they will be, a top 10 defense. But my gosh, what a big leap forward that has to be to go from being 43rd in the analytics rankings, 38th in the sort of simple scoring category, to inside the top 10. That's a huge leap forward. And by comparison, Georgia is in nowhere near the same kind of issue here for a moment. Georgia, by comparison, as you know, they were number one last season in points allowed per game nationally. They were also number one in the ESPN FPI category in terms of defensive efficiency, but their offense may be way better than people realize. Once again, that same sort of like analytic style rating from ESPN had Georgia as the number 2 offense. And had Georgia as, had Georgia as the number 2 offense. Georgia was also 8th in terms of the points it scored per game on the offensive side of the ball a year ago. So what's more reasonable here? What's more realistic here for the upcoming season? The Ohio State team can go from basically 40th defensively inside the top 10, or a Georgia team that was in the top 5 on both sides of the ball last year can kind of try to find a way to stay in the top 10. To me, it's a lot more of sort of like a sunshine pumping type thing to say Ohio State's defense can be way better for the upcoming season than it is to say that for Georgia, even though it's lost some guys off last year's team, can find a way to sort of statistically mirror what it did the previous year. I just think that Georgia probably sets up to start the upcoming season better than maybe a lot of folks kind of realize for this upcoming campaign. By the way, speaking of that Georgia offense and how it worked complementary with that Georgia defense, something that Ryan Day says that he wants to do. This is something that Kirby Smart himself has sort of talked about in this offseason thus far. Let's go back to June on that very topic of Kirby Smart, maybe with a lot more justifiable confidence in his offense, which is sort of thought to be the weak side of the ball for UGA, compared to what maybe Ryan Day is for his defense. Let's listen to this going back to June.
Well, it has, because especially last year, right now, that's all people talk about, 5 first-rounders on defense. That's an unbelievable stat. That's great. But what's overshadowed is we were one of the most explosive teams in college football last year. Now, we won a lot of games by a margin that we didn't get to continually pound people with explosive plays and numbers. But when you look at passes over 10 and 12 yards, we're top 5, top 10 in the country. So nobody even acknowledges that because they're overshadowed by this really good defense, and we'll have to be even better and even more explosive on offense this year because we probably don't have 5 first-rounders on our defense next year, but we've got some really explosive offensive players. Now, we've got a great offensive staff that they did some wonderful things as far as being explosives, but we probably didn't get the fourth quarter stats that some people had because early in our season we had some runs there where the games were out of hand.
And in other words, a very good offense for Georgia a year ago could have maybe been even better had Georgia needed that, but obviously didn't need to because of how it was coasting past almost every opponent that it played. Listen, I know I've given you a lot here. Let me see if I can kind of sum all this up here for a moment. That way back in the past, long time ago, Erk Russell said, we have no alternate plan for what we want to do here this season. We simply want to win every game. And Georgia went out and did just that. Georgia also got it done and won the national championship last year. And now there are some folks who think that maybe Georgia should be making alternate plans for this upcoming season of expecting less, selling for less, than another push towards a championship. But when you listen to what programs who are kind of on paper thought to be better than Georgia are saying, programs like Ohio State that were simply put bad defensively a year ago and trying to get better, actually by comparison, Georgia seems to be starting the 2022 season in actually a pretty good spot. That as you get ready as a fan to watch your team start practice next month, as it's almost on the doorstep of being here, and then begin the 2022 season shortly after that, there is no obvious reason why anyone should feel like they have a better chance of winning the national championship than Georgia does this year. Dogs were on top a year ago. They brought home the trophy. It's not obvious they plan on taking a step back here for this upcoming year. In fact, on paper, I think they actually set up pretty well. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We're presented by Meriwether and Tharp, and we're glad to have you with us. No matter how you get to us today, live on video, 10 a.m., Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch. We start even earlier than that, 9:45. They're on DawgNation.com and on the DawgNation app. We're just really glad to have you with us. No matter how you get to us in the video side of things, Radio Noon on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, or as a podcast, wherever you find them, Apple, Spotify, worldfamousDawgNation.com. Lots of ways for you to connect with our program. We're glad you do that, no matter how you do. Also, big thanks to our friends at Meriwether and Tharp for making it all possible. And listen, it's fun to talk about Georgia football. It's fun to get excited about the upcoming season. But a lot of you, though, are not excited about the current season of your life you find yourself in, the year that you're having, because maybe it's a reminder to you that you're in a relationship that's kind of coming untethered, that is almost coming to an end. And if you're like me or like a lot of people in our audience, maybe you've done everything you can to try to save that relationship, hold on to that marriage, and in some cases it just doesn't work, and I hate that. But what I can tell you is if you need to make the decision to move on, and if divorce is the next thing in the picture for you, my friends at Meriwether and Tharp can be your source for Georgia divorce. What that means is they can allow their expertise, the intricacies of the law they understand, the way in which that can be leveraged to your benefit. They can put all that to work for you, and they can set you up for a great deal of success on the other side of this divorce situation you might be finding yourself going through. I love the way in which they really step up and serve people, and a lot of this happens before you even hire them to be the ones that handle your divorce. A lot of this is free resources. If you go to their website, theatlantadivorceteam.com, that website, once again, theatlantadivorceteam.com, here's what you're going to see. Lots of blog posts, lots of podcasts, lots of resources that you can use to educate yourself. And then I think one of the best ways that can be used is when you have that free initial consultation with one of their attorneys. You have better questions to ask. You have a little bit deeper understanding of what you might be going through, and then you're more able to hear the expertise they want to provide for you. So check out the website, theatlantadivorceteam.com. Reach out, have that free initial consultation with one of their attorneys, and go along a path with Meriwether and Tharp towards a happier conclusion to what may not be a great story for you right now, but it can have a happier ending based on what you do with Meriwether and Tharp. So make sure you find them online at theatlantadivorceteam.com. Meriwether and Tharp is your source for Georgia divorce. All right, we're going to talk to Terrence Edwards here in a moment. Georgia's got some interesting news as it relates to wide receivers, including a big commitment. We'll get to Terrence on all of that coming up here in just a moment. Before that, though, I want to set that up by going around the doghouse here and talking about the addition of Yazeed Haynes yesterday, 3-star receiver, recent Penn State commitment, decommits from the Nittany Lions, makes the move there towards Georgia. We'll show on the screen here a good-looking edit from him with the red helmet, the black jersey, the red pants there, or red breeches, I guess Georgia fans would say. It's actually a really cool uniform combination. It looks good on Haynes as he celebrates being committed to the Georgia Bulldogs here. And, I think a lot of this kind of unearths a certain conversation about the receiver position at Georgia. Some of this I'm going to get into a little bit more deeply tomorrow's show. But I think the immediate response to Haynes is a lot of positivity from Georgia fans, just from the standpoint that, Penn State's, been a kind of a recruiting power here in the 2023 cycle. Wrestling away a receiver that was going to Penn State probably represents a win from UGA. This is a guy at one point in time that was also committed to Rutgers as well. And, now he's sort of, certainly if you're Haynes, you love the fact that you kind of stair-stepped it from Rutgers to Penn State, now at Georgia. I think you feel really good about that. He's obviously an example of a prospect on the rise here. And the thing that for Georgia fans, I think they gravitate towards pretty heavily, and I'm sure if you're UGA, one of the reasons why he turned so many heads for them so quickly when he first, got on campus for, camping and visiting, things like that, was the fact that he does just legitimately have kind of blow-you-away speed. And if there's any trend that Georgia seems to be pursuing when it comes to its 2023 recruiting cycle, getting faster at the receiver position is one of those things. Georgia's got, I think, a pretty good crop of wide receivers here on the field for the 2022 season. I don't know how much you say blazing speed is a prime characteristic for many of these guys, maybe with the exception of Arian and Chandler Smith. Those are the two guys you would say probably have the true blow-you-away type speed. That has not always been a hallmark of Georgia, the receiver position, even for some of its best receivers. But that's one of the things that a guy like Yazeed Haynes seems to be bringing to the table. And a lot of the receivers that Georgia's pursuing here in this class are kind of known for that same kind of thing there as well. So maybe a little bit of a shift change in terms of the kind of receivers that Georgia's going after. That's some of my early thoughts there on that. I want to get some more of these from our good friend Terrence Edwards, and so we'll talk to him about what he likes about Haynes and kind of what it means to have that kind of speed at the receiver position. His expertise on this, always incredibly valuable. There's also a big-time receiver taking a visit to Georgia here this weekend. That's kind of a fun thing to think about there too. So let's keep the conversation going here on the heels of Georgia getting a receiver commitment yesterday from Yazeed Haynes, a very fast-moving story that went from being offer to commitment really in almost no time whatsoever. So for more on that now, let's talk to Terrence Edwards here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Meriwether and Tharp.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
So we'll say hello to Terrence Edwards here, DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp. And Terrence, Georgia got itself a receiver commit yesterday. This is one of those guys, admittedly, I really didn't know at all until a couple of weeks ago. Gets the Georgia offer and then, kind of very quickly ends up as a Georgia commitment. It seems like Georgia was really impressed by the speed that he brought to the table. And he's got more, I would say, than just speed, but that's certainly the thing that seems to be kind of the standout characteristic. Have you seen much of Yazeed Haynes? Obviously, Penn State wanted him. He had to be a recruit of some caliber, and now Georgia likes enough about him to sort of give him that committable offer, and he jumps on that pretty quickly. Can you tell us anything about what you might have noticed, if anything at all, about Yazeed Haynes?
Oh, most definitely. I didn't know much about him till about, I guess, a month ago when he did get offered, and I went and kind of did my background research on him, and knowing that he's committed to Rutgers at one time, then committed to Penn State. So that lets me know that, a lot of people didn't know about him. And he kind of burst onto the scene, and I think Georgia somehow, some way, got their hands on it. I know once B-Mac became in charge of the receiving corps, and I heard about him then. But one thing that you do notice is about his fluid. He's very fluid. He's straight line fast, but he's very fluent at the line of scrimmage, and he's very fluent at the top of his break. So that lets you know that if he have to outrun someone, he can. But if he has to be a controlled route runner to get in and out of break, he can do that as well. So I'm very excited about this guy. I'm continuing to watch his progression. I'm going to continue to watch him. And I did know, going through his Twitter feed, that he did come to Georgia at one time and did some training with the DB coach OD. So he has been into the Atlanta area. And so hopefully I can get some eyes on him the next time he comes to just see for myself him what he can do in person. So I'm very excited about this receiver, and DawgNation should be excited as well.
So as I hear you talk, there's something kind of pops in my mind, and maybe this is the wrong analogy to use, but it's my, I guess, picture in my mind based on what you're saying, which is that, in baseball, it's sort of thought as a pitcher, you don't want to have the same speed all the time, right? That, it's Major League Baseball players can time a freight train if you show them the same velocity each and every time, that you have to be able to change your speeds. And, sometimes you're throwing at max velocity and sometimes you're comfortable throwing a little bit less than that. Is it the same thing for a receiver where, hey, sometimes I literally want to try to run past you, but other times I want to see if I can use, as you say, a more fluid running style to kind of create an opportunity for myself that, that's not just simply trying to run past you, because eventually the defensive back that's covering you sort of knows what's coming? Is that kind of what that's about?
Most definitely. And I always try to watch kids and try to understand who their game pattern after. And this probably will get the Georgia faithful kind of excited. Not saying he was going to have the same production as his kids, but his body style and his receiving skills remind me of Devontae Smith. Devontae Smith is a great route runner, but he also has the vertical speed to get past people. And I'm not saying that he's going to have that type of production, but his skill set reminds me of Devontae Smith.
That's really interesting. And when it comes to receiver position in particular, it seems like sometimes this is a position that we see be maybe a little later developing, because so much of this is about taking raw athleticism and turning it into something that's a little bit more polished, the kind of thing where you do have those ball skills, or that ability to kind of understand the route tree. What is it about the receiver position in particular that allows a guy like Haynes to kind of not really be on the radar of a program like Georgia, and then very quickly that all changes to the point where he kind of goes from Rutgers to Penn State to Georgia, seemingly, sort of making a bigger move towards a better program with each one of those decisions? What is about kind of that development as a wide receiver that sometimes it seems like it occurs over the course of a high school career heading towards college, and maybe not quite always as obvious as it might be for some of the bigger players playing along the line of scrimmage, things like that? What is about the receiver position in particular that kind of makes that be true?
And, sometimes some kids just develop later. Some kids just cap out earlier. Some kids just are physically gifted. There's a lot of reasons why one kid may fall up under the radar than others. I mean, I could think of a receiver, Calvin Johnson. Calvin Johnson wasn't the biggest name receiver coming out in his class, but look how he turned out. I think his better days was more college pro than he was high school. So some kids just develop faster than others. Some kids are just physically better than others. And then camp circuit. The camp circuit is big. I think if he didn't do the camp circuit, which I don't know if he did or not, that also plays a part on have you been seen? What type of school you at that does it produce players on a normal basis for scouts and everyone else who comes to that school? So there's a lot of factors that factors into why he was an unknown last year. Maybe he was just an unknown nationally, was a known up in the Philly area. There's a lot of things that comes into play. But just looking at the kid, I love that, he was a late guy that blossomed to the scene, because I tell parents all the time, you don't have to be that guy that gets offers in the 8th or 9th grade. Your path may be a little different than others, but at the end of the day, we ended up at the same spot, no matter when you got your offer or when you committed.
Another guy who I think that's kind of true for a little bit is a guy named Tyler Williams, 4-star receiver out of Lakeland, Florida, who, and we'll show you this on the screen here if you're watching on video, announces that he's taking another visit to UGA. Of all of the kind of, sort of top shelf receiver prospects in the 2023 class, this seems to be a guy that Georgia has a really pretty good relationship with. And as you said before, one of those guys that I think has kind of seen his reputation as a receiver really grow. Have you seen much from Tyler Williams? This is a guy that Georgia fans, I think, are having some growing confidence that the Dogs might be able to land. There's some other receivers you're going to wait and find out on at a later date, but some Georgia fans seemingly have a little bit of a growing level of confidence when it comes to Tyler Williams. Have you seen this young man out of Lakeland, Florida, and kind of what he brings to the table as a receiver?
Yes, I definitely watched him. I do know I'm a little biased towards him because I do know he was a quarterback last year and he transitioned to receiver this year. So he's very new to the receiver position. But what I saw on film, he's a very explosive at 6'5". So you bring in a big-body guy that can stretch the field, and it's a good athlete. I think his better days is in front of him because of his rawness at position and only playing the position for 1 year. He will have this year, but I do know he's one of the top guys that's on the board. And it would be a fantastic haul if we get the 2 Williams kids out of Florida.
Let me ask you this about the Georgia offense overall, because I think obviously this is going to be a very important year, for that on the field. It's year 3 of Todd Monken. Getting him back, I think it's a big coup for UGA, and specifically at the wide receiver position where, Georgia doesn't necessarily have the same level of recruiting success there as it's had at other position groups. Now, there are certainly plenty of talented players are on hand there, but I'm curious, do you think this is the year that Georgia has a big breakout from a statistical standpoint for a wide receiver? Because everybody expects Brock Bowers to have a great year. He had one last year. You and I have talked plenty about Eric Gilbert. I told you last week that I think that Gilbert could really be a very big breakout player in this Georgia offense. And obviously, you get into Darnell Washington, Oscar Delp, and all those great tight ends. Georgia's incredibly deep there. But when it comes to guys who specifically wear that wide receiver label, if you look at what Georgia has been under Kirby Smart, forget your season, 1,000 yards back in 2002. Let's just sort of think of like that sort of 700-yard mark, pushing 800 yards. That's a really big number for a Georgia receiver typically in this Smart era. Do you think this is the kind of year where a guy who is specifically a wide receiver can kind of knock on the door of that 800 yards receiving? Because that's kind of a lot for a receiver in the current era that Georgia's in. And, I think there are a lot of people thinking year 3, Monken might have a chance to produce that. Do you?
I do. And I think people are fixated on Georgia not having a 1,000-yard receiver besides me in history. But I think it'd be a great year if we have 2 receivers, and I'm counting Brock in this. We have 2 pass catchers with 800 yards or more. I personally don't see us having a receiver that's going to get 1,000 yards. Everyone knows how much I love A.D. Mitchell. I love Ladd. I just don't know because we are so deep at the tight end position that we will have a 1,000-yard receiver this year. I do know that Georgia is going to open up even more because the trust factor. I mean, people just think about it. This would be the first time in how long that we'll have the same starter going into the season since Jake Fromm.
Right.
So I think the coach is very trusting of Sexton now. We all know the type player Sexton is. I know people are ready to cast Sexton out, but if you just look at his stats and his minimal amount of starts, he had 27 touchdown passes to only 6 interceptions, and you could take that to your bank. Imagine now if, with another year and the coaches now can really expand and open up and trust Sexton with the complete playbook. I can imagine him being in the 35 to almost 40 passing touchdowns.
Wow.
With the explosion that we have. I can see that. So I expect the ball to be pushed around to a lot of different players because we have a playmaker. So I would be very happy if we have two receivers with 800 yards this season.
So you mentioned the continuity of bringing back Stetson Bennett as quarterback. How much does the year 3 of Todd Monken matter? Like, how much more comfortable do guys get into this, and how many more buttons can a guy like Monken push now that he's been kind of instilling the same sort of philosophical mindset and strategic, I guess, principles for these last couple of years? How much more potential does that unlock for the Georgia offense here this year?
I think so. I just think it unlocks everything because of the trust factor, and I keep using that word, the trust factor with the quarterback position. Stetson has been with Monken now for 3 years, so they should have a rapport that Stetson understands what Coach Monken is trying to do and trying to accomplish within a play. So that comes that Coach Smart is going to trust Stetson to be the guy that we all know Stetson to be, that I know he could be. Yes, he's going to make some of those plays that make you scratch your head, but that's what you got to live with because of the gamer he is. Is there more talented guys than Stetson out there? Yes, but I'm glad Stetson is our quarterback. He's a national champion, and now Coach Monken can hopefully unleash everything that he wants to do offensively.
On a completely different note here for a minute, the other day we were having some fun when you and your good friend Takeo Spikes got put into the Georgia High School Football Hall of Fame. Thinking back to those great days with Rick Tomlin as coach at Washington County, you gave a shout out to the Dairy Lane, one of those places that you enjoyed frequenting back in that era, and we had a good time with that. One of those great eating spots down there in middle Georgia. Well, I got this on Twitter. I'm going to show you this on the screen here for a moment. Cowboy HBTFD sent this for me. He says, "If you know, you know," at DawgNation Daily. And Terrence, I'm probably not watching on video, but he sends a picture here of the Dairy Lane down there, and that's a great throwback and a great memory. I know many a Georgia fan has kind of stopped by and eaten there over the course of years, especially as you kind of make that drive from time to time through there. And it's nice to see Cowboy HBTFD on Twitter sending that photo in, Terrence, kind of throwing back to a place that I know you very much enjoy.
Most definitely. So I think, tell you this, BA. So I don't get home very much, but when I do, I have a guilty pleasure of going and we have these cheeseburgers that is world renowned and these sausage sandwiches with cheese is one of my favorites.
How about that?
So I would order 10 cheeseburgers, 10 sausage sandwiches, and take them home and freeze them and eat them throughout how long it takes me to eat them. Then my kids eat them, but I have to hoard cheeseburgers and sausage sandwiches when I go home and take them back. That's my guilty pleasure when I go home.
Listen, there's nothing like that food from these spots that you grew up with, and they're not fancy places, right? I mean, like the places from like I grew up in Hall County, like the places that I kind of enjoy there, like it's not fancy stuff, right? You order from the counter, you sit down, you eat it, but man, I'd go back and eat that food right now if I could. Absolutely, like that's just what sort of the stuff is, right? Those are the things you just sort of enjoy, right?
Oh, most definitely, and my little brother. B.T. Walker's father was the owner of the Dairy Lane, Ben Walters back in the day, and big Georgia fan. So he called me the other day and very appreciative of me shouting out the Dairy Lane. So I'm going to give him another shout out. B.T., if you're listening, my little brother loves you, man.
That's awesome to hear. Terrence, before we let you go, remind us how we can get in touch with that Terrence Edwards Wide Receiver Academy. You're doing great things for all kinds of pass catchers, the high school and soon-to-be college players in a lot of ways. Remind us how we can get in touch with you on that.
Before I do that, I'll be remiss not to say this on air. My good friend, my quarterback, Quincy Carter. If you haven't heard, you saw on Twitter and he's been tweeted out. Quincy was kind of the butt of jokes about his substance abuse throughout people, and he has been. But now, can we all send Quincy a congratulations of being 3 years sober? And we all understand his demons that he had to get over, and 3 years sober now. So all DawgNation, somehow, some way, reach out to Quincy through social media, through email, whatever you form a way to get in touch with Quincy, and send him a real encouraging text. 3 years sober, and I'm proud of my brother. I'm proud of my friend. I'm proud of my quarterback. But on that note, you can find me at all social media, Terrence Edwards, Wide Receiver Academy.
Terrence, I'm so glad you said that because I saw that on social media there as well. 3 years sober is a real accomplishment, and it's a great celebration. And we had Quincy on the show about a year or so ago. I had a blast talking to him on the show. It was my first time really getting a chance to speak to him, and I do think this is one of those things that years later, like you said, butt of jokes, whatever else, which is obviously a sad thing, but years later, I do think the entire career of Quincy Carter is being reconsidered. I saw where DJ Shockley said one of the reasons why he wore 3 is because of the way in which I guess Quincy made that number famous when he was at Southwest Cab. Yeah, there you go on the screen right there. Quincy Carter says 3 years clean and sober today, and his caption for his photo going back to his Southwest Cab days was, "I'm starting to feel like this guy again," that's really good, meaning he feels like his old self back when he was a young player growing up. And Terrence, I'll tell you this, going back and rewatching some of those fun Quincy games, 98 on the road at LSU comes to mind here. That's some good highlights. Quincy, big arm, great athlete, really good baseball player in high school. A lot of people forget that there as well. I just love to see where he's at now. I know he's also doing some great coaching, working with some quarterbacks and things like that. I guess he's in the state of Texas, I believe, doing that. But it's a great accomplishment. 36 months sober is no joke. That is a lot of work that goes in to something like that. And I'm just happy to see him in such a good place. And I'm happy to know that in a lot of ways, some of the fun moments he had as a football player, a great high school player at Southwest DeKalb, second-round draft pick, I guess, of the Dallas Cowboys, and some fun moments as a Georgia Bulldog there as well. I'm glad to seeing some of that getting the reconsideration that it deserves.
Most definitely. I talk to him very often, and I just want to say that publicly to my brother that, that's hard work. I don't know the word because I'm not in that situation, but I only can imagine how much work he has to put into, being clean for 3 years. And we just continue to send out blessings and prayers to him that he continue on this path.
Plus, if you want to know how good he was, coming out of high school, coming to a place like Georgia, when he first showed up on campus, there are about 9 quarterbacks who transferred the next day, it seems like. They took one look at him and that big arm and his athleticism. They said, my best chance of playing is going somewhere else. I think Georgia had a record number of quarterbacks transfer out of the program basically the first day he stepped on campus.
Oh, most definitely. There's a lot of quarterbacks transferred out, and I could be happy. John England decided to give up football, and I had 19 in my first spring, and I did not want to be compared to Hines because that's the position I was taking. So my very first spring, people probably don't know, I wore 19. As soon as John England decided to give up football, I ran up to Coach Dunn's office. Please, can I have number 8? I got to get out of this 19. So fun fact story for you today, BA. Guess I got 8 because I wore 19 my very first spring, and I didn't want to be in that Hines category because I was playing the same position, been mentioned about being Hines 2.0 besides being the blocker he was. And I had to get out of 19 to get 8, and that's how I got 8 because of Quincy came in, John decided to give up football, and I jumped to Coach Dunn, and can I get 8? And that's how I got 8.
Man, that's a good story, Terrence. Thanks for sharing that. That's really good stuff. I appreciate your time here today. Always love talking to you, and we'll look forward to having you back here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp again very soon.
Thank you, BA.
Good stuff.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
So this is actually a pretty good topic for maybe another day. When you look at numbers, Georgia jersey numbers, like there are a couple of numbers that have a pretty good history connected to them. And 19 is one of them. And I don't fault Terrence Edwards at all for saying, hey, I want to wear Hines Ward's jersey because, as Terrence said, given his sort of versatility as an athlete, the fact that he was a high school quarterback, he was naturally going to draw that comparison. It's going to be hard enough for Terrence as it is because his brother Robert was a great player. So you're already getting the comparison to Robert. The last thing you want is to be like, he's Robert Edwards if he was crossed with Hines Ward. Like, that's not a level of expectation you want to attach to any player coming to the program. So angling out of wearing that number 19 is I think that's a smart thing to do. And the number 19 all the way around, like that's a pretty valuable number in Georgia football history, right? You had Hines who wore it. Charles Grant was 19, right? And for other guys who've been kind of stuck with that 19 number, I would say Mudcat Elmore had that. That it does kind of become a little bit of of a bird. I'm not saying it's necessarily a historic number. Not every Georgia fan kind of walks around that sort of working knowledge. But 19 has a lot of history to it. A lot of good players have worn it. It's been a very valuable number at UGA. And it's easy to kind of understand why Terrence would have tried to avoid that if he could and get that number 8, which when I think of Terrence Edwards, that's the number that I think of him wearing. Another number like that's 47. Dan Jackson's wearing 47 right now. But Terrence's brother Robert wore 47. David Pollock wore 47. It's another one of those numbers. It's had a pretty, kind of both sides of the ball type thing. Kind of a versatile history there with UGA. Kind of fun to think about the numbers, like all the different players who've worn it, the jersey numbers that have been most valuable for UGA over the years. Number 19 would definitely be one of those. That's a good story from Terrence Edwards there on that. All right, we're going to get ready to go cruise around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean here. Before we do, let me remind you about my friends at Royal Caribbean. Great chance for you to plan your Royal Caribbean cruise vacation. True story, as I am talking to you here right now, I got a message 10 minutes ago via email about a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation I have coming up in the month of February. This is a true story. This is happening actually live as we're speaking. Already kind of making plans for doing that. I'm hopeful that next February when I take my Royal Caribbean cruise vacation, I am in just as good a mood as I was last February when I took a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation. Obviously, I'll be in a great mood about taking the cruise no matter what, but for me, that cruise last winter ended up being sort of a celebration of what had been a great year, a celebration of a Georgia National Championship and a really fun year for growth for DawgNation as we covered all of that. And boy, I hope to be in a similar place as I am on the seas with Royal Caribbean here across the Caribbean coming up this upcoming February there as well. Now, the good news for you is you don't have to wait until February to take your next Royal Caribbean cruise. You can take one right now, or maybe it's your first Royal Caribbean cruise vacation. Trust me when I tell you this. It is as much fun as I say it is. If you think you'd love it, I promise you would. And if you're skeptical that you might, trust me when I tell you, I think you'll have a blast. And our friends at the Cruise and Vacation Authority can help you with that even more. They can help you pick the Royal Caribbean cruise vacation that's perfect for you. So find them online, tcava.com. That's the website, tcava.com. That is the website. Or give them a call, 770-952-8300. That's 770-952-8300. You can find them today. All right, I want to get a few stories here as we go cruise around the SEC for a moment with Royal Caribbean. Yesterday, as expected, five-star safety Caleb Downs chose Alabama over Georgia and Ohio State. This is a very good player. Georgia got an elite safety last Saturday, but would have liked to have had another one when it comes to Downs. And for whatever reason, this one just never really happened. Downs is a terrific player at Mill Creek. He's setting up for a really fun senior season. Mill Creek going to be a part of our coverage of the Corky Kell Classic coming up really just a few weeks. So we get a chance to see Downs in person on TV there for that event. But it just seems like it was never really Georgia. For a long time, it was Ohio State, not Georgia. Now it's Alabama, the official commitment winner. Once again, still just not Georgia. This one just never really got off the ground, and now it's done. And sometimes it's just as easy to predict as you imagine it would be. Pretty much everybody thought Downs was going to Alabama, and that's exactly what he did. This was also kind of fun yesterday. So Missouri coach Eli Drinkwitz, who's a pretty cool person out. I don't want to say cool. I think what makes him fun is the fact that he's sort of not cool and sort of unapologetically uncool. But Drinkwitz goes on the Jim Rome show. I was being asked about his record. He sort of shot back at Tennessee here in the recruiting that infractions involved in the Jeremy Pruitt era, saying that some of those wins for Tennessee are going to be vacated and he might be getting a couple of wins back. I actually don't know that it works that way. If a win is vacated, I don't think the other side gets the win. I just think the game is sort of rendered a no contest, I think. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But there is sort of some weird bad blood. Like, if you're really deep in the SEC, you kind of know this, is that two teams in the SEC that sort of secretly hate each other are Tennessee and Missouri. They fought over a few recruits from time to time, and there has been a little bit of bad blood between the Tigers and the Vols, two teams that you would think of having no relationship whatsoever. They secretly have kind of gone back and forth here a little bit. Some of that, like, sort of like hat toss, recruiting stuff. Like, some of this has been, and the specific names are escaping me because they're so far below Georgia's radar you don't even notice. But they've had some of this back and forth a little bit. So Drinkwitz kind of doing, something that a lot of SEC coaches don't do, which is going on a national radio show, old school Jim Rome, and basically taking a shot at Tennessee. Now, I kind of halfway wonder, this is sort of a PG-13 version of that. It's not too serious. But it seems like the other day the commissioner was kind of putting it out there that he didn't want any more public airing of grievances. If you had an issue, speak about it privately, don't speak about it publicly. I wonder if what Drinkwitz did in kind of calling out Tennessee via the national radio show kind of runs afoul of what the commissioner wants in the aftermath of the Nick Saban-Jimbo Fisher showdown. Don't quite know. This wasn't too intense necessarily. But Drinkwitz, once again, kind of proving to be the kind of coach that's not afraid to speak his mind. Lane Kiffin has also spoken out as well. He was obviously asked about the comments from Matt Corral, where Corral certainly strongly insinuated he regretted choosing Ole Miss. I thought that Kiffin's response to this was probably pretty good from a PR standpoint, basically saying that he wasn't there when Corral first got there. That's obviously going back to the Matt Luke era. But essentially saying, hey, Matt Corral's starting in his NFL career. This won't be the first time that he misspeaks about something. And Kiffin basically insinuated that Corral would probably like to have that statement back, and almost kind of acting sort of a gracious and forgiving way for the fact that Corral kind of, as Kiffin would say, misspoke about not wishing he would have gone to Ole Miss. That's probably cleaning up a little bit of a mess on behalf of his quarterback. I think from a PR standpoint, that's probably pretty cool and probably pretty well done there by Kiffin. But here's the thing. We keep coming back to this when it comes to a guy like Lane Kiffin. You have to be very careful about stuff like this. That if you create a transactional relationship as coach with player, eventually your players will create the same kind of relationship with you. And you've seen the T-shirts that Ole Miss kind of brags about, that Kiffin tweets about, that transfer to the SIP. The SIP is what they call Mississippi. The idea that Ole Miss wants to kind of run this sort of mercenary-style program with soldiers for hire. They sort of bring in for 1 year and get the most out of them, let those guys kind of move on to go to the next place, in some cases the NFL, some cases it may be another transfer somewhere else in future years. When you create that kind of transactional relationship for your program, eventually your players will see it the same way. It almost seems like what Lane Kiffin has established the Ole Miss football program as is sort of an AAU basketball team where everybody's here for a reason, not for a season, that they're just sort of here to, kind of sort of further themselves as football players, and they move on with like no level of sentimentality about the program whatsoever. And we don't have to look very far to see another example in the SEC of how this doesn't really kind of work out. Like, look at Kentucky basketball. Kentucky basketball has been like first or second in recruiting almost every year, basically every year since John Calipari's been head coach. But y'all, they don't win anything. They haven't won anything in forever. They're consistently. I mean, you can set your watch to them being a massive flop, disappointment come March. NBA talent galore. Recruiting rankings, they're at the top every single year. But there is something about team sports, about needing to be a team. And if everybody is there because it's kind of the hot place to be as a sort of a short stopover until I'm old enough to be in the NBA, it's just hard to get the kind of buy-in you need from a team there in that regard. And Kentucky basketball is the perfect example of that. The level of talent they've had does not produce the kind of winning that it should because, frankly, nobody really seems to care very much about where they are while they're there. And I think that on a much lesser plane, that's what a program like Ole Miss has the danger of becoming if all Lane Kiffin's going to do is go out and kind of find the sort of transfer type player that also has very little tie to the program. It's also one of those things as a Georgia fan. When you hear former Georgia players on their way to the NFL saying something very different, when you hear former Georgia players saying about their time at UGA, how much they enjoyed it, how much they feel proud to have been a part of it, when you see videos of the national championship celebration, you see former Georgia players back in that locker room really proud to see what players after them did. I'm thinking about DeAndre Swift in particular here. When you see that go on, don't take that for granted. It's not that way everywhere else. I don't believe it's that way at Lane Kiffin's Ole Miss, even though people fall all over themselves to sort of praise Kiffin as a coach. I don't think he's creating the kind of program there with the Rebels that has permanence. And listen, Ole Miss has never been a big winner, but this is a program that does have some history. This is a program that does have some pride. And kind of what they're becoming if their quarterback goes on the NFL and sort of shows the sort of flippant disregard to say, I wish I would have played somewhere else. That's Kiffin making Ole Miss into something less than what it used to be. And It's hard not to notice that. One more thing to get to here really quick. So we mentioned earlier that Big Ten media days are going on, and one of the things that's kind of coming up there and sort of a big topic, the things that Commissioner Kevin Warren has to say. Now, much the same way that a lot of folks were very interested in speaking to Greg Sankey at SEC Media Days recently, Warren kind of the same way. Very interesting to note that one of the things that Warren at one point in time was heavy pushing for, all of a sudden now he's not quite so interested in that anymore. You know, the idea that in playoff expansion you would have to guarantee a spot in the playoff for Power 5 conference champions. That was a real sticking point for Warren as recently as a few weeks ago. All of a sudden now that's no longer true. And man, I just think this speaks to kind of exactly what he is as a leader and the kind of mediocrity that seems to rise to the top when it comes to the Big Ten. It just seems like he, as a little bit of a stand-in for the whims of the Big Ten university presidents, is willing to change his tone and completely adopt a totally different mindset because that's what suits the league in the moment. This was true back in 2020 when the league was adamant that the season had to be canceled, and then once the SEC showed a healthy and safe way to play, all of a sudden now, tail tucked between its legs, it sort of followed in the SEC's footsteps, and now you've got the same kind of thing. That when the SEC seemed like it was way out in front of the rest of college football by adding Oklahoma and Texas, all of a sudden Kevin Warren didn't want to cooperate. The Big Ten, represented by Warren, didn't want to cooperate anymore with playoff expansion because he thought it benefited the SEC way more than it benefited his league. Well, now his league's added USC and UCLA, and just like that, a man with seemingly no guiding principles whatsoever, all of a sudden now he's fine with playoff expansion without guaranteed spots for conference champions because all of a sudden now he feels like he has a power league that sort of rivals what the SEC brings to the table as they get ready to add the two schools from Los Angeles. Make no mistake about this. As the SEC and the Big Ten kind of move forward as clearly the two leagues far ahead of the rest, there are also great differences between the two leagues themselves too. They are partitioned off from the rest of college football because of their size and their revenue and everything else. But the way in which these two leagues go about their business could not be more different. And this has more to do than just the fact that the SEC has the far better players. I think it has the far better leadership there as well. You can say what you want about Greg Sankey. I believe for the most part, Sankey's been very consistent throughout everything. Warren, by comparison, simply hasn't been. And I think in the future, when we start talking about competing visions of the sport, Sankey, representing the SEC, I just think has a much better vision for the future than what Kevin Warren seems to have there for the Big Ten. And the sort of odd backtracking and sort of tune changing that it's gone on this week at Big Ten Media Days is the perfect example of that. We'll make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. I'll also remind you that tomorrow, I believe it's tomorrow. Certainly it ends this week because we're about to start making these announcements. Yes, tomorrow is the last day for our Kroger 5-Star Kids nomination. It's a really cool thing. We want your child or a child that you know to be a part of our nomination process to have a chance to be one of our Kroger 5-Star Kid winners. We're going to draw 5 winners at random starting the week of August 1st, which is next week. We're going to announce those 5 winners here on the show, but there is still some time for you to get that nomination in. Go to info@DawgNation.com. Send the email there, info@DawgNation.com. Tell us why a child that you know or your own child should be one of our Kroger 5-Star Kids. And if your child is one of our winners, they're going to get a great package of gifts, including a collection of gift cards worth $250, including a big one there from Kroger. Also, a Kroger DawgNation 5-Star Kids t-shirt there as well. So it's some really great stuff. We want you to be a part of it. Send your nomination in. The email address, info@DawgNation.com. You can also visit DawgNation.com if you want some more details on this as well, courtesy of our friends at Kroger. All right, signing off here today, a couple of golden shoes to do so. We always like to give out the golden shoes as a way of making fun of those lousy, stinking Gators. And today, let me show you the first one here. Our buddy Mad Dog, always excellent. Here's his for today, saying, other coaches may be cool, but they're not skydiving on the back of a great white shark while shooting pistols in the air cool. And you see Kirby Smart doing just that, or at least a rendition of Smart doing that in the picture here from our buddy Mad Dog. That's really good stuff. Stephen Burton also sent this there as well. He says he got I guess it's a replica national championship ring. Looks like Jordan Davis's replica ring. Can you buy these? Is that what this is? That's incredible. I'd love to have one of those. I've got one of the Braves replica rings. Have not seen the chance to get a Georgia one, but that's really cool there. Obviously, replicating what Jordan Davis got. Steven also told me on social media he's going to Ric Flair's last match this weekend, too. So Burton here, very cool in a couple of fronts there on that. Let me tell you what's not cool, though. It's those lousy, stinking Gators. How about a long, long time since they won a national championship? 4949, 4,949 days. And Gator Hater Countdown back in Jacksonville. 93 days from right now. That is our Gator Hater Countdown. We will see all of you back here tomorrow for DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price that's promised. You can trust R.S. Andrews to do that for you here today. We are glad to have you with us, and we hope you are ready for some fun comments. We'll kind of dive in and get as many of these as we can. Let me start on YouTube. DSA1 says $49.49 sounds like a price. Yeah, that's about right. That's good stuff. But listen, there is no price that Florida could pay to change their inglorious history, long national title drought, and it's not changing anytime soon. Let's see what else. Pat Patterson says the number 10 for a Brazilian soccer player is equal to the number 3 for a Georgia running back. Yeah, that's about right. That's a good one, too. Very good one. Jonathan Aaron says, when you spoke with Drinkwitz at Media Days as he was leaving, did he say, may the force be with you? No, he didn't, but that was certainly good when he took that jab at Dan Mullen last year. That's good stuff. Good stuff. I like that. Jerry Dogs fan says, Kirby and Kiffin seem to be friends. Would Kirby bring Kiffin in as offensive coordinator if Monken left and Kiffin was available? I wonder about that. I don't know. At this point in time, I think Kiffin probably sees himself as, a head coach. But the one thing I can't help but notice is for all the attention that Kiffin gets from fans and media, when we had a very busy coaching carousel that spawned this past offseason, you never really saw Kiffin's name show up in any of that as any kind of serious consideration for a bigger, better job in Ole Miss. Kiffin just doesn't seem to be in that category, but he probably is in at least the head coaching category for most of the rest of his career now. Texas Dog says, don't sleep on Andrew Paul. He's going to be one good running back. So Texas Dog, who we're always happy to see in our comment section here, weighing in to shout out Andrew Paul. I think that's probably correct. Foster Moss says, was Matt Corral a UGA commit at one point? So he was not a UGA commit, but he was a UGA target, and it seemed like that Corral had some love for UGA, and that's one of the things I did think about, which was when Corral kind of, if he is truly regretting going to Ole Miss, is he thinking about Georgia? Because the way it worked is that when Georgia was getting down the road with Justin Fields, Corral was sort of the other quarterback there. And I remember on our show at the time, we were debating, hey, is Corral good enough that if he was willing to commit prior to Justin Fields, would you jump in there and would you take Corral just as a kind of a risk aversion of you don't want to run the risk of not having any elite quarterback. So do you take Corral and not wait on Justin Fields? It's a little bit like what maybe Alabama did this year with Eli Holstein. Should Georgia have done that back in the day with Matt Corral? The place that Corral was committed was to Florida. And I swear, of all the things that Dan Mullen did wrong at Florida, to me, this is one of the wrongest things of all. The fact that it seemed like Mullen really zeroed in on Emory Jones, who was not a Gator commit when Mullen first got the job, zeroed in on him, and kind of the perception that I have is he kind of shunned Matt Corral in doing so. And, I mean, how much different is the Mullen era at Florida had he stuck with Matt Corral as opposed to kind of throwing all of his weight behind Emory Jones? That never seems to get a lot of attention, but to me, of the errors that Mullen made, that's as significant of one as exists, I think. Thomas Tyson says, don't be surprised if Andrew Paul outperforms Branson Robinson. That's an interesting take. Joshua Langford says, what's your Oregon dog score prediction? I've said it before. I think Georgia shuts out Oregon. That's a ludicrous hot take. Totally acknowledge that. But I am going to stick with it. I believe that Georgia puts a 0 on the scoreboard next to the Ducks there that day. And however many points Georgia scores is how many points they win by. That's my take. Spencer Clark on the subject of Brian McClendon maybe becoming a head coach. Yeah, I mean, he's certainly, kind of a fast-rising guy there on that. It'll be interesting to see what he's able to help do with the Georgia wide receiver situation here this year. Kirby Smart's diary says, which team has the best chance to upset UGA this season? I would zero in on those 3 true road games Georgia plays, maybe at South Carolina. More likely, maybe the back-to-back road games, Mississippi State and Kentucky coming in November. If Georgia's challenged in the regular season, I believe it'll be during a true road game, and those 3 are the 3 that would kind of come to mind there. So Thomas Tyson says he's not meaning to say anything bad about Branson Robinson, but he just thinks Andrew Paul's been shining. Hey, maybe that's the case. Spencer Clark says Tennessee's the threat. I just don't see it. I don't. I don't. I think that Tennessee may be a top 25 team here this year, but, Arkansas, coming into Athens a year ago, complete house of horrors. We talked about this a little bit on yesterday's show, that when you are dominant at home and when you're making home wins look easy, you're able to put a lot more emphasis in the games that truly matter. And Georgia has one big home game this year. It's against Tennessee. I think fans will be ready for it. I think the team itself will be ready for it. I think the Georgia roster in November, now think about this, over the course of a long season, by the time you get to that third month of the season, you're talking about a lot of attrition. You're talking about players injured. You're talking about, having to move on to backups. You're talking about, a roster that just gets thinner. There's a stress test that goes on for a football team during a season. And Georgia, I believe, is just more, capable of handling that stress test. That Tennessee's got good-looking quarterback, good-looking wide receivers, got some firepower on offense. But what do they look like on the other side of a stress test? What do they look like on the other side of just natural season-long attrition? Loss of player personnel. What do they look like at that point in time? The Georgia version of that come November is still pretty talented. The Tennessee version of that come November, maybe not quite so much. And Georgia dominated Tennessee in its stadium a year ago. With Tennessee coming to Georgia Stadium this year, is there any reason to believe that things have changed all that much? I just don't see any obvious factual data to suggest that things will be that different. Yes, Georgia is missing some players that it played in Knoxville last year. They've moved on from the program. I simply don't believe that changes all that much. Spencer Clark says he agrees with me, but offensively they are legit. I don't deny that. I don't. I'm not that down on Tennessee overall. I believe this probably is a top 25 team. Pat Patterson said, this is a good question. If the USA had a football team in the Olympics, who should be the head coach, the offensive coordinator, and the defensive coordinator? Well, just on the basis of the career he's had, you probably got to make Saban the head coach, right? I would think that's probably fair. There's no better defensive mind than Kirby Smart, so he's probably that guy. Who's your offensive guy? Is it one of these NFL offensive guys? Is it Sean McVay? You put McVay, and some people say, how are you going to put the Super Bowl winning head coach as an assistant under Nick Saban? I got no problem doing that. Is it McVay as your offensive coordinator, Saban as your head coach, Kirby's your defensive coordinator? Is that what it is? Who's the best defensive mind in football other than Kirby Smart? I'm sure I'm probably leaving out somebody obvious. And I don't just mean college football. I mean football in general. Who's the best defensive mind in the sport right now at all levels other than Kirby? Darius Smith Sr., always great to see him in the comments section here. And thanks for being a part of what we're doing here. I certainly appreciate that. We're certainly very excited about seeing Darius here this fall. That's true. That's true. Crow King 123, yeah, Brent Venables, that's a guy you got to consider. And listen, I got to tell you, I'm slightly high on Oklahoma for the upcoming year. There is a chance that I put Oklahoma as my 4th playoff team. Would I be crazy if I did that? Because there's a chance I might. Oklahoma for me ahead of Texas or Clemson. I'm not even willing to listen to USC. That's completely irrelevant to me in terms of a playoff discussion. But when I think about like a Texas or a Clemson, probably more a Clemson, I think there's a chance with Dylan Gabriel at quarterback, with a little bit more of toughness in the program, manageable Big Ten schedule, a little bit of a sticking it to Lincoln Riley, who, left where he thought were greener pastures. There's a chance I might be high enough on Venables in Oklahoma to put them in the playoff this year. Jay Shipe says I'm stalling by not reading his Lane Kiffin comment. Jay, at this point in time, we've done that. We've just done that so much. Caleb Meyer says the Braves need to string together some more wins. They do. I'm getting slightly concerned about Ronald Acuna, I guess. Slightly concerned about that. The other night, Snit held him out and, not just giving him sort of the extra rest, but, admitting the fact that he's just kind of struggling a little bit. That I think they're at least thinking about, kind of what's going on there on that and how much of this is like trying to come back from injury or I don't know what. But I'm slightly concerned about Acuna right now. Alan Verbanchik says Robert Beal and Nolan Smith are going to be putting Bo Nix on his back. Alan, of course, on Facebook to say that. I think you're right. Part of my reason for predicting the Georgia shutout against Oregon is the fact that Bo Nix has barely scored in 3 times playing Georgia prior to this. I also think, and y'all got to follow this away, we're going to have Pac-12 Media Days coming up. It'll be interesting to see if Lanning gives voice to this. I also think there's a chance that Ty Thompson, who went to the Manning Passing Academy, performed pretty well there. I think there's a chance that Thompson either plays a decent amount against Georgia or maybe just becomes the outright starter. Like, it's not obvious to me that Bo Nix is going to be Oregon's starting quarterback. And I think this is going to start setting up something where at some point in time, we got to start paying attention to this. Now, there are certain media types that will never do this because they're cheerleaders for the transfer portal. They like, radical change, and so they'll never do this. But I think somebody should do this. Look at all these quarterbacks who transfer that end up not being the starting quarterback where they transfer to. I have a little bit of a theory that happens a pretty good bit where, hey, you go somewhere, but the grass ends up not being, greener where you're going. And listen, that hasn't happened yet with Bo Nix. It may not happen. He may be that quarterback for the team. The truth is, Nix actually had a pretty good year last year, other than when he played Georgia. But I do think that, you think about between TJ Finley and Zach Calzada, that's 2 pretty high-profile transfers, SEC to SEC. One of those guys is not going to be the starting quarterback. Let's watch what happens to Max Johnson at Texas A&M, places like that. Let's just start watching some of these transfer quarterbacks and see what happens to them when they transfer. Because I do feel like we see a little bit of a developing trend where teams are taking on transfers for depth, for competition, without really making much of a promise that they'll be the eventual starter. That's what at least I feel like I'm noticing. Maybe you notice the same thing. Miriam Corbin says Nix has never beat us. This year won't be any different. So Miriam weighing in on that. Bill Sanders, I can't read that comment. Let's see what else. Hugh Nash says that Acuna is getting frustrated in his head, losing patience at the play. Yeah, baseball is one of those sports, man, where you got to have that right mindset. And I'm certainly not smart enough to know if Acuna does or doesn't right now, but I do think you see that sometimes where poor performance compounds a bit. And it's just sort of hard to shake that off sometimes. And you kind of wonder if some of that's going on with Acuna right now. Jerry Popham says Ozuna also, yeah. Unfortunately, that's the case. And you've even seen, the Braves kind of move Ozuna down in the lineup some as a response to all that. Tim Yarborough says that he thinks the Dogs' raw talent on defense will be able to cover up on not being settled in. Yeah, I mean, when you've got a potential top-end performer, we're going to talk more about Nolan Smith on tomorrow's show, but when you've got a potential top-end performer in all 3 levels of your defense, y'all, that's fine. This idea that, oh my gosh, Georgia has this crisis of what it's lost from last year's defense. There is a very real chance it's got a first-round pick along the defensive line, in the linebacking core, and in the secondary. I'm talking about the 2023 NFL draft. There's a very good chance that Georgia's got at least one first-round pick in all three phases of the defense. Like, this idea that Georgia is in this crisis of, talent being lost, I just don't know that that's the case. I just don't. Let's see what else. Lynn Johnson Shipman says all of the SEC analysts are going all in on Tennessee as the third or fourth best SEC team, except McElroy. He has Arkansas, LSU, A&M above Tennessee. Yeah, see, that's where the comparison gets really interesting. Everybody agrees that Alabama and Georgia are the top two teams in the SEC, and eventually they'll probably fight it out over who the best is. Right now, Alabama's being picked there. But what happens when you get into the comparison of what's next? Who is that third best team in the SEC? And where does the second best team in the East, Tennessee, in the minds of some, although that's not even a unanimous thing because they weren't picked to finish second by the media last week, but where does that sort of next group of SEC East teams compare to that next group of SEC West teams? And I just don't know about that because, like, the real wild card here is Texas A&M. And for all that y'all give me a hard time for in our comment section for maybe sometimes having been a little too high on Jimbo and the Aggies, you haven't heard me say as much of that here this year. I don't really project them necessarily having much more than 9 regular season wins. I don't know that I necessarily see that for them, which means it's not obvious they'll be the third best team in the SEC or the second best team in the West. I do think Sam Pittman and Arkansas are a really very interesting discussion there. The one thing I mentioned on I was off for a couple of days, at the beginning of the month, and one of the things I mentioned on those pre-recorded shows is, or maybe this is going back to my vacation in June, but on a pre-recorded show at some point in the summer, one of the things I said is, like, to me, the thing that stands out about Arkansas is, I'm not quite so sure, if you want to take Georgia out of the equation here for a moment, I'm not quite so sure that Arkansas doesn't have the best tandem of coordinators in the entire SEC. That on the open market, Kendall Briles, the Arkansas offensive coordinator, would be very attractive. Barry Odom, we know how attractive he is. Texas tried to spend big dollars to bring him in and couldn't. When Steve Sarkisian first got hired, they failed to do so. That's what Arkansas's two coordinators are. And I think that matters. Pittman is kind of the sort of CEO face of the program. Two very sharp guys, cut from slightly different cloth, but very sharp guys in Briles and Odom as the top lieutenants. That makes the Hogs really dangerous. It does, really dangerous. Marshall Fleming, I apologize. Yeah, Bill Belichick. That may be, even after all these years, he may still be the top guy when it comes to the defensive side. You're probably right about that. So if you're going to have, as one of our commenters said, an Olympic football team, a Team USA football team, does Belichick get the head coaching nod over Saban? Maybe he does. Maybe he does. Maybe he does. Let's see what else. Bill Sanders says, at a strict OC role, I'm taking Steve Sarkisian as offensive play caller. Yeah, his time with the Falcons doesn't support this, but I kind of agree with you. I think that Sarkisian is a brilliant offensive mastermind. I really do. I thought that his performance as Alabama offensive coordinator in 2020 is probably the best that Saban has had. He's had some good ones, Brian Dable and obviously Lane Kiffin, who I think is a really sharp offensive mind there too. I don't love Kiffin as a head coach, admittedly, but I love him as a play caller, as an offensive type guy. But I think that Sarkisian in 2020 was the best that he's had. Now, Sarkisian was criticized in the 2016 national championship game, and maybe justifiably so. But his performance as OC for the season long in 2020, he was actually Alabama's most important coach that year, I believe. He was more important than Nick Saban, I think. Let me go to DawgNation.com. A couple of more minutes here. Jay Shipe says, do I really think that Kiffin is declining the Rebels program, coming off their program only 10-win season? He says, spin zone confirmed. I'm not talking about from a performance standpoint. I'm talking about from a pride, look, history and tradition matters, right? That that there is a certain prestige that programs have. And you can say, well, Ole Miss has less prestige than some other SEC programs. That's probably true. But having less prestige doesn't mean the prestige is non-existent. But when you make your program into essentially a truck stop, stopover for transfers, you run the risk of devaluing what people once loved in exchange for just some tiny little foothold upon which you can compete right now. That's the risk that you kind of run here on this. I don't think transfer to the SIP is a strategy. I don't think that's a platform for building a great program. I don't. And Lane Kiffin's open flirtation with other programs, constantly going back and trying to get Tennessee fans stirred up, openly campaigning for a better job than what he currently has. I also think that's kind of beneath the dignity of Ole Miss there as well. I do. I mean, Kiffin's clearly a big social media personality, and he's obviously a sharp offensive mind. And last year, Ole Miss won a lot of games. But I think the overall presence of Kiffin in Oxford has the risk of eventually diminishing the program from where it was before he got there. DT brings up a really good point about Ronald Acuna, that he may be tripping as he watches Juan Soto turning down 4 times the contract that Acuna signed. They get compared a lot. You're right. Soto and Acuna do get compared all the time. Soto did turn down a $450 million contract. And I sort of thought this at the time. Like, I don't talk Braves for a living, but I sort of thought this at the time, that it was sort of celebrated that the Braves got Acuna for such a bargain when they did. It was sort of thought that, well, Acuna just wants sort of lifetime, guaranteed money here. He's taking a safe bet on himself. And sometimes, players who've turned down big money when they're young, they never get that money back. Jeff Rancour is probably an example of that it doesn't always work when you bet on yourself. And some people kind of sort of spun the Acuna deal is, well, he just wants to sort of settle for the kind of money that will sort of change his life and his family's life forever, even if it's way less than market value. And the Braves were kind of celebrated as this sort of genius organization for locking up Acuna to such a long-term deal at such a discounted rate. And it was discounted at the time, and it even seems more so now. But part of me wondered, giving Acuna that little money, does that become kind of a destabilizing thing for the organization? I'm honestly not smart enough to know if I'm right about this, but I did kind of wonder about that. It's like that becomes a little bit of a benchmark for how you handle future contract negotiations. Think about like Dansby Swanson for a moment. You have Dansby Swanson making more money than Ronald Acuna, but would a guy like Swanson settle for the Acuna contract? You almost think he probably wouldn't. Or you almost certainly think he probably wouldn't. And does eventually, there's no really recourse for holdouts in Major League Baseball. We've never really seen that. But does eventually Acuna get really frustrated that he clearly made kind of a bad financial decision? And I don't know. The Acuna contract, I do think, is probably a part of this. I'm not saying that he's pressing because of frustration with his contract. Obviously, none of us can know that. That's kind of an unknowable thing anyway. But I do think when you think about, what Acuna is going to be post-injury, last year's World Series didn't really belong to him. That happened while he was watching. And when you think about what his career is going to be post-World Series, the bad contract decision is kind of be a part of that. Jay Shipe's going back to the Jimbo Fisher thing. But right now we're talking about Lane Kiffin. We're not talking about Jimbo Fisher. We're talking about Lane Kiffin. So I gave you my opinion on Lane. The opinion on Jimbo Fisher might be totally different. Some of y'all would say, hey, Jimbo Fisher needs to start winning some games. I don't disagree with you on that. But in this particular case, I'm not comparing Lane and Jimbo. I'm just speaking to you about what I have some concerns about when it comes to Lane Kiffin. J-Pop. A very funny look back at Erk Russell there on that. Jay says, I'm going to fall off the wagon when Ole Miss wins the West. I may very well do that. By the way, that's something that program's never done. The SEC teams have never won a division. A&M, Ole Miss, Kentucky, Vanderbilt. Is that it? Everybody else in the SEC's won a division except for those, right? At some point in time. All right, final trip to the comment section, then we're going to go. Back on YouTube for a moment. Let's Go Brandon says, oh, he's got the old Nintendo Duck Hunt. I like that, Let's Go. That's cool. I like that a lot. That's really good. Really good. Pat Patterson, you never know. That'd be a lot of fun. We've had some good times with those folks in the past. We might do that again at some point in time there as well. Foster Moss says about Ole Miss Vanderbilt for the SEC championship. That'd be a heck of a baseball series. Jerry Dogs fan. That's really funny. Tethers in the players' shoes to keep the fans safe. That's really fun. Really funny. That's funny. Jonathan Aaron says at Media Days, you think Billy got a signed mustard bottle from Lane and asked him to make it out to Carl. That's really funny. Good stuff. I like that. Christian, on the subject of Kirby Smart going into Alabama, there's obviously a lot of that left with James Smith, Quay Russo over there after what Alabama's done in state this year and what Alabama's done in state before. Maybe Georgia will get a chance to return the favor with some big names from the state of Alabama before this recruiting cycle is done. What else on YouTube before we go? All right, Facebook here for a moment, then we got to go after that. Let us see. We didn't talk that much about the Braves. We mentioned the Braves like 3 times. I feel like over the course of what goes, this is almost going to be a 2-hour show by the time it's all said and done. I feel like we're on topic like 90% of the time. And listen, I know some people want it to be always 100%. But I feel like I am not taking the heat for being off topic. We are very rarely off topic. Very rarely off topic. And listen, this is also the excuse me, pardon me. This is also the people's time. It's not like I'm bringing this stuff up unsolicited. I'm responding to what commenters say. Sandy Price says the best 2021 stat, 33-18 for the national title, accomplishment that was done when they walk on and a host of 3-stars. Sandy, that's really good stuff. Very well said. Yeah, Philip Jordan Wells giving me criticism. Hugh Nash says, I spit out my coffee when you said turn down $450 million. He did. He turned it down. Almost $500 million. Crazy. Randy Hall, some funny stuff on Les Miles. All right, we got to go for now. Thanks for being here, y'all. Appreciate it for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. Y'all check out R.S. Andrews online. It's hot. I guess 90-something degrees yesterday. Well, guess what? You can get your air conditioning unit tuned back up to factory fresh specs, and it'll keep you cool all summer long. They'll do it for you. It's just $99. You can do that then. Also, so make sure you check them out online at rsandrews.com. And also check out the AJC online, ajc.com. There is more on the Braves concluding their series. They're in Philadelphia, off here today, of course. Also some good stuff about Ron Washington. They're going to have that really cool Ron Washington bobblehead coming up in September, which I think is kind of fun. Wash, obviously one of the good dudes, and a good look at him there at ajc.com. And how about some very low expectations for Georgia Tech for the upcoming season? A little bit more on that there at ajc.com there as well. So all of that for you there online, ajc.com. Make sure you check that out. We will see you tomorrow as well. It's DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Thorpe. We'll start at 9:45 for our 1st and 15 there at DawgNation.com on the DawgNation app. 10 a.m. everywhere after that on video. Glad to have you with us. We'll talk to you then, everybody.